Right then, this is AQA Psychology. This is genetic factors in aggression, and this is looking at what specific genes have been identified that we know play a part in aggression, rather than looking for a specific genetic cause. And the gene that we have come across, that we've identified, is to do with something called MAOA, which is an enzyme which works in our synapses. And what happens is, after a nerve impulse has been transmitted, MAOA breaks down the neurotransmitters. Some of the neurotransmitters are taken back up into the presynaptic neuron. You can see that here. You've got the reuptake pump, and you should know this already as well from last year. But some of the things, some of the neurotransmitters actually are broken down by enzymes in the synapse, and MAOA is an example of one of those enzymes, and it actually breaks down serotonin. And so actually MAOA is produced by a gene, and that's called the MAOA gene, very imaginatively, and it determines how much MAOA is produced and is in our brains, in our synapses. And what happens if we have a dysfunction or a problem in this gene, it affects how much MAOA is produced, and we don't have the right amount of MAOA in our synapses to deal with the recycling of neurotransmitters. So what might happen, and that's called, if you have a dysfunction in this MAOA gene, it's called the low activity version of MAOA. So it's called, we refer to it as MAOA-L, the L for low. And what happens if there is less MAOA? Serotonin builds up and is overactive. And this has been found to be a contributory factor in aggression, or it's been found to be linked to aggression. And we'll look at a couple of studies now that have found this genetic link between this MAOA-L gene and they've also looked at MAOA levels in the brain and the link between aggression. So let's look at those now. The first one is an interesting case study by a guy called Brunner, and he looked at a Dutch family, basically a family with lots of aggression going on and violence, participating in violent crime and so on. And he studied this family, and he found that they all had this defective version of this MAOA gene. And they all also had abnormally low MAOA levels in their brains, and so the link was made that actually this aggression may be down to the fact that this MAOA gene is not working properly, and that their serotonin is not being broken down in the right way. And then a second supporting study was a guy called Moffat, and he actually studied 442 males in New Zealand, and he studied them over, it's a longitudinal study from birth to the age of 26, and he looked at those with MAOA-L, and he found that those who had the gene and who had also suffered from abuse were 9 times more likely to be antisocial and aggressive. Interestingly, he didn't find a link just between the gene and aggressive behaviour. So it's a really interesting study because it tells us that there is some kind of link, but actually it suggests that it's more complex than just this gene means that you'll be aggressive. Actually, in his case, he found that wasn't true, and that there had to also be some kind of environmental trigger. In his case, he found the link with, if they experienced abuse, they were far more likely to go on to be aggressive, but if they had the gene. And that's actually what we call a diathesis stress model, which here I've put in our evaluation. The diathesis stress model, if you remember, is where someone is vulnerable to developing a certain problem because of their biological makeup, because of their genes potentially, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily will go on to develop a behavioural issue. It means that they could develop it, but what's needed is actually what we call the stress in the diathesis stress model, is something in their environment which then triggers this issue to be set off. So someone could have, in this case, we're suggesting that someone might have the MAOA L gene, but that doesn't mean they're going to be aggressive. It might mean that they display normal levels of aggression until something in their environment actually triggers aggressive behaviour. They have some kind of negative experience, a stress, which will then trigger them to become more aggressive. So that's one of our evaluation points, actually. You can't say that the warrior gene, the MAOA the MAOA gene, is what's causing aggression, but actually we need to have more of an approach of it's involved in aggression, but we need to look at it in a diathesis stress model. Okay, then we've got this other evaluation point here relating to reductionism and determinism. So looking at the MAOA gene is really helpful in certain ways, because if we hadn't been able to isolate it and look at it in relation to other factors, we wouldn't know that it was involved. So it's good in some senses that we have taken a reductionist approach, that we've reduced this complex behaviour of aggression down to simple factors so that we can identify which genes and which factors might be involved. However, we have to be really cautious in being this reductionist, because you have to remember it's a really complex behaviour. Actually, to even try and say this gene makes you aggressive is just ridiculous, because we have so many genes acting all together in many different ways. They affect us in different ways. There's also other things as well as genes that affect us, social factors, cognitive factors, and so on. So to say that actually aggression is down to this particular gene is just hopelessly reductionist. So it's really important that you understand that actually we probably need to take, if we're looking for the cause of aggression, we need to take a more holistic approach and look at the human on many different levels at once. Ideally, to say actually this complex behaviour comes out of the very complex interaction of all of these different factors, social and cognitive and behavioural and evolutionary, and all of these different factors on many levels work together in complex ways to produce a complex behaviour. It's not a case of you have the MAOAL gene and you will be aggressive. It's also deterministic, because it says that it suggests that if you have the gene, you'll be aggressive. Actually, do we want to screen criminals as they go to court and let them say, I've got this gene, therefore it's not my fault that I killed someone, give them a get out of jail free card? Actually, our experience suggests that we have free will and we have control over our own behaviour. We can make conscious choices. We ought to be responsible enough to have an aggressive impulse and be able to control it and say that's not the right thing, I'm not going to do it. So that's a really big issue, saying that our genes determine our behaviour in this case. But one positive evaluation point of this is that actually if MAOA is involved in aggression, that would explain sex differences in aggression, the fact that males tend to be more aggressive than females, actually because the X chromosome is linked to this particular gene. So that is the end of genetic factors in aggression.